Ambassador Kim Day stepped off the transport shuttle and onto the gleaming platform of Nexus Prime. The space station stretched endlessly in all directions, its crystal walls catching starlight from a dozen different suns. He had traveled 3 months to reach this place, carrying with him the hopes of every human back on Earth. His black suit was perfect, not a wrinkle, not a speck of dust. The fabric had been woven by master tailors in Seoul, each thread representing generations of human skill and tradition. When he looked in the mirror that morning, he saw more than just clothing. He saw dignity, he saw respect, he saw everything humanity wanted to project to the galaxy. The corridors hummed with alien voices, speaking in languages he couldn't understand. Strange creatures floated past him on anti-gravity platforms. Some had tentacles instead of arms, others had multiple heads or no heads at all. But they all shared one thing in common: they barely noticed him. Kim Day walked slowly, taking in every detail. The walls seemed to be alive, pulsing with soft blue light. The floor beneath his polished shoes felt warm, almost organic. This wasn't just a building. It was a living organism, grown rather than built. The technology here was beyond anything humanity had ever imagined. Guards flanked the entrance to the main chamber. They stood 12 feet tall, their bodies covered in metallic scales that shifted color like oil on water. Their weapons hummed with contained energy. One of them scanned Day with a device that made his skin tingle, but they didn't stop him. After all, what threat could one human possibly pose? The chamber doors opened with a sound like singing crystal. Inside, the space was vast enough to hold a small city. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above, while the floor was a perfect mirror that reflected everything twice. And there, arranged in a perfect circle, were the thrones of the Council of 12. Each throne hovered 10 feet off the ground, slowly rotating so their occupants could observe everything below. The beings sitting on them were ancient beyond human understanding. Some had ruled their species for thousands of years. Others had lived so long they had forgotten their own names. Council Prime Veltar occupied the largest throne. His species looked vaguely reptilian, but with 6 eyes arranged around his head and skin that changed color with his mood. Right now, that skin was a bored shade of gray-green. He had been expecting this human for weeks, and the anticipation had long since faded into mild irritation. Kim Day walked to the center of the chamber. His footsteps echoed in the vast space, each sound sharp and clear. He stopped exactly where the floor markings indicated, then bowed deeply in the traditional human gesture of respect. The silence stretched for nearly a full minute. The council members whispered among themselves in languages that sounded like music or grinding stone, or the rush of wind through metal. None of them looked directly at the human standing below. Finally, Veltar's attention drifted downward. His 6 eyes focused on the small figure in the black suit, and his skin shifted to an amused shade of yellow. "So," his voice rumbled through translation devices that made every word echo strangely, "the primitives have learned to sew fabric together. How very quaint." The other council members joined in with sounds that might have been laughter. Some clicked their mandibles. Others released puffs of colored gas. One creature that looked like a floating jellyfish pulsed with rhythmic light. But the message was clear. They found this human and his carefully chosen outfit amusing. Kim Day felt heat rise in his chest, but his face remained perfectly calm. He had practiced this moment 1,000 times. He knew they would try to provoke him. "Honored Council," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "I come as ambassador of Earth, seeking peaceful relations between our species and your great civilization. Humanity offers friendship, trade, and the sharing of knowledge for mutual benefit." Peaceful? Veltar's skin shifted to deep purple, the color of contempt. One of his appendages, something between an arm and a tentacle, gestured dismissively at Day's appearance. "You stand before us wearing the crude wrappings of a species that has barely crawled out of its caves. You speak of trade when you have nothing we could possibly want. You offer knowledge when you understand nothing of the forces that govern this galaxy." The other council members murmured agreement. Their various forms of communication created a symphony of dismissal that needed no translation. "You have no rights here, human," Veltar continued, his voice growing harder. Your species is not recognized by this council. Your world is not protected by galactic law. You are, in essence, nothing more than an upright animal that has learned to speak. Kim Day's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he forced his voice to remain steady. With respect, Honored Council Prime, humanity has achieved faster than light travel, quantum communication, and fusion energy. We have art, literature, music, and philosophy spanning thousands of years. We are not the primitive species you believe us to be. Art. Veltar's laughter was like grinding metal. Literature, music. His skin flashed through several colors before settling on bright orange. Child, my species was composing symphonies of pure thought when your sun was nothing. But cosmic dust not yet collapsed into a star. With casual indifference, as if swatting an annoying insect, Veltar raised one appendage. Energy crackled along its length, building to a bright point of focused power. Consider this your formal rejection, he said, and fired. The energy beam struck Kim Day's jacket with surgical precision. The fine fabric burst into flames that burned with unnatural colors before crumbling to ash. The smell of charred material filled the chamber. Not just burnt cloth, but the destruction of something crafted with care and worn with pride. Day stood there in his white shirt, bits of ash falling from his shoulders like black snow. The carefully pressed jacket that had taken weeks to select, that represented humanity's finest craftsmanship, was gone, reduced to nothing in an instant. Now leave, Veltar sneered, his skin cycling through shades of satisfied green, before we decide that you are as disposable as your crude clothing. For a long moment, Kim Day didn't move. He stared down at the ashes around his feet, then slowly brushed the remaining fragments from his shoulders. When he finally looked up, his dark eyes had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. You have made a mistake today, he said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness. A very grave mistake. He turned and began walking toward the chamber doors. His footsteps echoed differently now, not the respectful pace of a supplicant, but the measured stride of someone who had just declared war. As he reached the threshold, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. The council members had already lost interest, returning to their private conversations as if he had never existed. I will remember this moment, Kim Day said, his words cutting through their chatter like a blade. And I promise you, so will the galaxy. Then he was gone, leaving only the faint smell of burned fabric and the echo of a promise that would soon reshape the stars themselves. 3 months passed without a single message from Earth. The galactic communication networks carried no human voices, no diplomatic requests, no pleas for reconsideration. The silence was so complete that many council members forgot humans existed at all. In the crystal towers of Nexus Prime, Council Prime Veltar occasionally mentioned the incident to visiting dignitaries as an amusing story. He would gesture with his appendages, recreating the moment he burned the human's jacket, and his guests would laugh at the primitive species that had dared approach the mighty council wearing nothing but sewn fabric. They scurried back to their little world like frightened animals, he would say, his skin shifting to pleased shades of gold, as expected from such a primitive race. But on Earth, in a bunker buried 3 miles beneath the Swiss Alps, something very different was happening. Ambassador Kim Day stood at the head of a conference table that hadn't existed 4 months ago. The room around him buzzed with activity that would have been impossible to imagine before the Council's insult. Holographic displays showed star maps, weapon schematics, and resource calculations that made the most advanced human technology look like stone tools. His new suit was identical to the burned one in every way that mattered. Black fabric, perfect. Cut, immaculate tailoring. But this suit hummed with barely visible energy. Threads of quantum processors were woven into the fabric itself. Reactive fibers could harden into armor or conduct electricity at his mental command. What looked like a simple diplomatic outfit was actually the most advanced piece of technology humanity had ever created. Behind him, mounted in a place of honor, hung the remains of his original jacket. The burned fabric was sealed in a crystal case, every charred thread preserved exactly as it had fallen from his shoulders in the council chamber. It served as a constant reminder of why they were all here. Director Park Mina, Dee addressed the woman sitting across from him. In 3 months, we've accomplished what should have taken decades. The Council's insult gave us something we never had before, complete unity of purpose. Park Mina was a small woman with grey hair and tired eyes, but when she spoke, every person in the room listened. She had been South Korea's defense minister before the contact event, and now she commanded resources that spanned the entire planet. "Show me the numbers, Kim," she said, her fingers drumming against the metal table surface. The sound echoed in the underground chamber like a countdown timer. Day touched his tie, and the room filled with holographic displays. Every major government has contributed. The Americans gave us their black projects. The Russians opened their secret laboratories. The Chinese shared manufacturing capabilities they've never admitted to having. The Europeans provided theoretical research that was considered too dangerous for peacetime development. The displays showed facilities that officially didn't exist, underground cities where tens of thousands of scientists worked around the clock, factories that produced materials with names that hadn't existed in any human language 6 months ago, test sites where weapons were born that could crack moons in half. Dr. Lee Jun has been working on nano-assembler technology, Day continued, highlighting a section of the display. His machines can break down any matter at the molecular level and rebuild it into whatever we need. Feed them a chunk of asteroid metal, and they'll give you back a fully functional weapons platform. In a laboratory in Seoul, Dr. Lee Jun peered through a microscope at creatures smaller than viruses. His nano-assemblers looked like tiny spiders made of metal and light. Each one could reproduce itself 1,000,000 times over, and each one could follow incredibly complex instructions. Release them on an enemy ship, and within hours that ship would be converted into ammunition for human weapons. Engineer Choi Hana has disguised our kinetic bombardment systems as mining equipment, Day went on. To any external observer, they look like standard industrial tools, heavy, slow, designed for extracting minerals from asteroids. 3,000 miles away, in a facility built inside a hollowed-out mountain, Choi Hana supervised the final testing of her creation. The device looked exactly like a boring mining laser, the kind of equipment that drifted through space by the thousands, harvesting resources from dead rocks. But hidden within its bulk was a weapon that could punch through planetary shields and deliver enough kinetic energy to level entire cities. Strategist Yoon Tai has been analyzing every second of my time in the council chamber, Day said, bringing up tactical displays that made the room look like a war room. He's identified weaknesses in their security, gaps in their intelligence networks, and blind spots in their strategic thinking. Yoon Tai had watched the recordings of Day's humiliation exactly 437 times. He had analyzed every gesture, every word, every casual dismissal. He knew which council members were arrogant enough to ignore obvious threats. He knew which ones were too proud to believe they could be wrong. Most importantly, he knew they would never see humans as anything more than primitive animals until it was far too late. The beauty of their contempt, Day said, adjusting his quantum-enhanced tie, is that it makes them blind. They look at us and see cave dwellers who learn to wear clothes. They'll never imagine that those clothes might be woven with materials that don't exist in their periodic table. Around the table, the leaders of humanity's new war machine nodded in agreement. These were people who had spent their lives preparing for conflicts between human nations. Now they were planning something that had never been attempted in galactic history, a coordinated strike against a civilization that had ruled the stars for millennia. Our sleeper ships have been launching for 2 months, Park Mina said, pulling up another display. To anyone watching, they look like desperate refugees or hopeful traders, primitive humans trying to find their place in the galaxy. The ships were perfect disguises. Their hulls were painted with the kind of crude decorations that would make alien observers shake their heads in pity. Their engines looked like they were held together with determination and prayer. Their communication arrays seemed barely capable of maintaining contact with each other, let alone coordinating complex operations. But inside each ship, human engineers had packed enough firepower to sterilize a continent. The sleeping quarters held soldiers trained in combat techniques developed specifically for fighting in alien, Environments. The cargo holds contained manufacturing equipment that could build invasion fleets from captured materials. 68 ships, Day said quietly, positioned near every major council world. Each one crewed by volunteers who understand they might not be coming home. The volunteers had been chosen from millions of applicants. Military personnel, scientists, engineers, the best humanity had to offer, all united by the memory of their ambassador standing in a council chamber while his jacket burned around him. They underestimated us because of our appearance, Day continued, his dark eyes reflecting the holographic displays. They judged our entire species based on fabric and thread. They never bothered to look deeper, to see what humans are really capable of when we're properly motivated. He touched the crystal case holding his burned jacket, feeling the weight of what was about to begin. The council taught us an important lesson about galactic politics, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the buried command center. They taught us that respect isn't given freely. It has to be earned, and sometimes it has to be taken. Parkmina stood, her tired eyes now blazing with purpose. How long until our ships are in position? 72 hours, Day replied. Then in 72 hours, she said, the galaxy learns what happens when you burn a human's dignity. Outside, night was falling over Earth, but in the depths of the command bunker, humanity's greatest minds worked by artificial light, preparing to teach the Council of 12 a lesson they would never forget. The insects, as it turned out, had learned to bite back. The council chamber was in the middle of their monthly gathering when reality tore open like fabric. A brilliant flash of blue light appeared in the center of the room, crackling with energy that made the crystal walls vibrate. When the light faded, Ambassador Kim Day stood exactly where he had been humiliated 3 months earlier, but this time was different. His black suit seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Tiny threads of energy pulsed through the fabric like a heartbeat made of electricity. The air around him shimmered with barely contained power that made the ancient beings on their floating thrones shift uncomfortably. Council Prime Veltar's 6 eyes widened in shock. His skin immediately shifted to the deep red of alarm. How did you get past our defenses? How did you— Security, he roared, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. But the massive guards who should have come running lay sprawled in the corridors outside. They weren't dead, just sleeping very deeply. The same neural disruptors that had put them down had also temporarily blinded every scanner, every detector, every early warning system in the tower. No need to shout, Kim Day said, his voice carrying a calmness that somehow felt more threatening than any scream. He gestured casually, and 12 identical briefcases materialized on the council's meeting table with soft thumps. The council members stared at the briefcases as if they were poisonous snakes. These beings had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years. They had seen weapons that could crack planets and technologies that bent space itself. But something about those simple black cases filled them with a dread they couldn't explain. I brought visual aids, Day said, walking slowly around the table. His footsteps echoed in the chamber, each one perfectly measured. I thought you might want to see what your judgment has accomplished. He touched the first briefcase, and it opened with a soft hiss. Inside, where documents or weapons might have been expected, was a holographic projector that hummed to life immediately. The image it cast showed a beautiful world with purple skies and silver cities that gleamed like jewelry under twin suns. Krex, whispered Veltar, recognizing his own home planet. How dare you spy on— His words died as the peaceful scene began to change. The silver cities suddenly sprouted flowers of light that bloomed into massive explosions. But these weren't random attacks. Each blast was perfectly placed, surgically precise. Military installations vanished in brilliant flashes, while the civilian cities remained completely untouched. The sky above Krex began to rain silver fire. What looked like falling stars were actually kinetic projectiles moving at incredible speeds. Each one had been aimed with mathematical precision at weapons facilities, communication towers, and defense platforms. The planet's entire military infrastructure was being systematically erased, while families in their homes watched the light show through their windows, unaware that their world's ability to defend itself was disappearing forever. Impossible. Council member Thexera whispered, her tentacles writhing in distress. Our deep space scanners showed no human vessels. Our defense networks detected no incoming threats. How could you possibly— Day's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. That's because you were looking for ships that looked like ours. Big, obvious, primitive human vessels that your superior technology could easily detect and destroy. He touched. His tie and more briefcases opened. You never thought to scan the derelict mining equipment that's been drifting past your worlds for months. The other displays flickered to life, showing 8 more council worlds. Each one was experiencing the same precise dismantling. Ancient defense stations that had protected these planets for millennia were being carved apart by weapons that seemed to appear from nowhere. Military bases built into asteroids cracked open like eggs, their contents spilling into space. Those rusty old mining platforms, Veltar's voice cracked with disbelief. Those broken-down pieces of junk that we ignored because they looked too pathetic to bother with, were weapons platforms, Day finished, each one capable of manufacturing an entire invasion fleet from captured materials. We made them look like garbage because we knew you would dismiss them the same way you dismissed me. On the displays, swarms of microscopic machines flowed like silver water over council installations. These nano-assemblers were invisible to the naked eye, but their work was devastatingly visible. Weapons depots dissolved and reformed into ammunition for human guns. Communication arrays melted and rebuilt themselves as transmitters broadcasting human control codes. Council member Kixran, whose species communicated through color changes in their crystalline skin, flashed desperate patterns of yellow and red. Our civilian populations, they managed to say through their translator. What about our families, our children? Are completely safe, Day replied, and for the first time his voice carried something other than cold satisfaction. Look at your displays. See how every strike avoids populated areas? How every weapon targets only military installations? We're not monsters, Council member. We're not you, it was true. The orbital bombardment was hitting military targets with surgical precision. Spaceports burned, while the cities around them remained untouched. Weapons factories exploded, while the worker housing nearby didn't lose a single window. This wasn't random destruction. It was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of power. But how? Thexera's voice was barely a whisper. How did primitives like you develop technology we can't even detect? Day walked to where his burned jacket hung in its crystal case, touching it gently through the protective barrier. You want to know the truth? We didn't develop this technology. We already had it. Humanity has been preparing for first contact for decades, assuming that any species capable of crossing the stars would be hostile. We prepared for war before we ever left our solar system. The displays showed more worlds falling under coordinated attack. But these weren't invasions. They were precise surgical strikes designed to cripple military capabilities while leaving everything else intact. Human forces were fighting with a restraint that their enemies had never shown. Every mining ship you ignored contained enough firepower to sterilize a continent, Day continued. Every refugee vessel carried soldiers trained specifically for combat in alien environments. Every trade probe was actually a manufacturing platform capable of building weapons from asteroid debris. Veltar's skin had gone completely white, the color of terror in his species. What do you want? He demanded. Resources? Territory? Tribute? Name your price and end this madness. Day straightened his tie and smiled. The expression was polite, professional, and absolutely terrifying. What I want is very simple, Council Prime. I want you to remember this moment the next time you think about judging a species by their appearance. The sounds coming from the displays were no longer explosions. They were the steady rhythm of human construction equipment, rebuilding the destroyed military installations with human designs, human weapons, human control systems. The galaxy's most powerful civilizations were being systematically converted into human defensive positions. You judged us by our clothing, Day said, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. We judge you by your actions, and your actions told us everything we needed to know about galactic politics. Another briefcase opened, showing the Council's own defense fleets being carved apart by weapons that materialized from what looked like empty space. The primitive humans had been hiding in plain sight for months, positioning themselves perfectly for this moment. 3 months ago you burned my jacket and called me primitive, Day said. Today your worlds burn while you watch helplessly. Tell me, Council Prime, which one of us looks primitive now? The chamber filled with the sound of 12 civilizations learning that they had made the worst mistake in galactic history. They had insulted the dignity of a species that conquered their own world before reaching for the stars, and now the stars themselves were learning to fear the humans in their simple black suits. The terror that gripped the Council worlds was unlike anything they had ever experienced. For thousands of years, these 12 mighty civilizations had ruled the galaxy with absolute power. They had crushed rebellions, enslaved entire species, and wiped out those who dared to resist. But now, for the first time in their long history, they were the ones running in fear. Admiral Songhai stood on the command bridge of the human stealth carrier called Dignity. The ship was massive, yet completely invisible to enemy sensors. Around her, dozens of screens showed the destruction happening across Council space. 12 different worlds were falling one by one, like dominoes in a carefully planned sequence. The humans weren't just winning, they were completely dominating a fight that should have been impossible for them to survive. The Council had made a terrible mistake. They thought humans were weak, primitive creatures who could be easily crushed. They had laughed when the human ambassador first arrived. They had mocked human technology and called their species nothing more than clever animals. But now those same humans were systematically destroying everything the Council had built over millennia. Deep inside the Great Council chamber, panic ruled supreme. Veltar, one of the most powerful Council members, was desperately trying to find a way out of this nightmare. His voice shook as he spoke through the communication system, trying to reach the human ambassador who had started all of this. "What do you want from us?" Veltar's words came out in a rush, filled with desperation he had never felt before. "Do you want our resources, our territory, our trade routes? Tell us your price. Surely we can make a deal." But Ambassador Day remained perfectly calm. He sat in his chair as if nothing unusual was happening around him. His black suit was still perfectly clean and neat, despite the chaos erupting throughout the galaxy. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. "What I want is actually quite simple," Day said, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. "The Council of 12 will surrender themselves for trial." The word trial hit the Council members like a physical blow. Thexra, whose tentacle-like appendages were writhing in barely controlled panic, couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Trial," she repeated, her voice rising to almost a shriek. "By what authority do you dare suggest such a thing? We are the Council. We are the law in this galaxy." Day's response was delivered with the same calm tone, but his words cut like a knife through their arrogance. "The authority you gave us," he said simply, "when you declared that humans were unworthy of basic rights, when you told us we didn't deserve to exist as equals. You taught us a valuable lesson about how this galaxy works. You showed us that might makes right, that the strong can do whatever they want to the weak. We're simply better students than you expected us to be." Through the advanced technology built into his suit, Day could see everything happening across the galaxy in real time. The human war machine was operating with terrifying efficiency. Dr. Lee Jun's microscopic robots had grown far beyond their original design. They could now build new weapons from the wreckage of destroyed Council ships, turning the enemy's own materials against them. Engineer Choi Hana's orbital bombardment platforms moved in perfect coordination, raining destruction from space with the precision of a master clockmaker. Every human weapon, every strategy, every tactical move had been planned with ruthless intelligence. The Council had underestimated not just human technology, but human cunning and determination. They had expected a quick, easy victory over a primitive species. Instead, they found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. Veltar's frustration was growing by the minute. "Your ships hide behind stealth technology," he shouted. "If you're so superior, then fight us honorably. Come out and face us in open battle. Day's laughter was soft but chilling. It was the laugh of someone who had been deeply insulted and was now enjoying his revenge. "Honor?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "You incinerated my jacket and called me a primitive creature. You dismissed our entire species as unworthy of respect. Did you really expect us to line up our ships in neat rows so you could destroy them more easily? Did you think we would make the same mistakes that cost so many other species their freedom?" On the screens around Admiral Song Hai, another council. Stronghold went dark. The lights that had burned for thousands of years were suddenly extinguished forever. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any explosion could have been. Day's final words were spoken quietly, but they carried the weight of an entire species' determination. "Surrender now," he said, "or watch everything you built over." Thousands of years turned to ash and dust. The message was clear. The age of council dominance was ending, and humanity's time had begun. The great council chamber that had once echoed with the arrogant voices of 12 mighty civilizations now stood in ruins. Broken stone and twisted metal littered the floor, where ancient thrones had once commanded the respect and fear of an entire galaxy. The beings who had ruled for thousands of years were now on their knees, their heads bowed in defeat and shame. The Council of 12, who had destroyed countless worlds and enslaved entire species, were now experiencing something they had never felt before: complete and utter powerlessness. Their massive fleets had been scattered to the cosmic winds like leaves in a storm. Their heavily defended worlds lay defenseless, their shields down and their weapons silenced forever. The authority they had wielded for millennia had vanished like smoke, leaving nothing but bitter memories and the taste of defeat. Ambassador Kim Day walked slowly across the debris-covered floor, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. His black suit remained perfectly pressed and clean, a stark contrast to the destruction surrounding him. Behind him stood Director Park Mina and Admiral Song Hai, their faces showing the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. But it was the burned jacket hanging on the wall behind them that told the real story, a simple piece of human clothing that had started the greatest war the galaxy had ever seen. Day stopped in front of the kneeling Council Prime Veltar, whose once proud form was now broken and trembling. When Day spoke, his voice carried the weight of 12 dying civilizations and the hopes of countless species who had suffered under Council rule. "Council Prime Veltar," he said, his words measured and deliberate, "you find yourself facing a choice that millions of beings under your rule never received. You can accept exile to the furthest reaches of the galaxy, beyond the galactic rim where even light struggles to reach, or you can demand a public trial for your crimes against the dignity of sentient life." The silence that followed was deafening. Most of the council members, those who still possessed enough wisdom to understand their situation, chose exile without hesitation. They knew that disappearing into the empty darkness beyond the galaxy's edge was far preferable to facing the alternative. But a few, still clinging to their old arrogance even in defeat, demanded their right to trial. Those few would soon learn that human justice was nothing like the arbitrary cruelty they had practiced for so long. It would be precise, methodical, and completely without the mercy they had never shown to their own victims. The trials would be fair, but the evidence against them was overwhelming, and the sentences would reflect the true scope of their crimes. As the smoke began to clear across 12 star systems, Day walked to a communication console that would broadcast his message across the entire galaxy. With the press of a button, his image appeared on every screen, every display, and every communication device in what had once been council space. Billions of beings across thousands of worlds would see and hear what he had to say. "Citizens of the galaxy," he began, and his suit seemed to catch and reflect the light from the burning council ships that were still visible through the chamber's massive windows. "Today marks the end of an era. The council's reign of terror is finished, and a new chapter in galactic history begins. The human commonwealth extends an offer of partnership to all species, all worlds, and all civilizations. But this partnership will be built on mutual respect and equality, not on the assumed superiority that destroyed the council." Behind him, the last of the council members were being led away in restraints, their ancient power finally broken forever. The sight sent a clear message to anyone watching. The age of tyranny was over. Director Park Mina stepped forward to join Day at the console. Her voice was firm but not threatening as she addressed the countless beings listening across space. Humanity has no desire to rule over you as the Council did, she said clearly. We want to work with you to build something better together, but you must understand one fundamental truth. Respect is something that must be earned through actions, not demanded through force. Those who cannot learn this simple lesson will find themselves following the Council into permanent exile. As the broadcast ended and the galaxy began to process what it had witnessed, Day calmly adjusted his tie and allowed himself a small smile. The suit had indeed made the man, transforming a simple diplomatic insult into the catalyst for galactic revolution. But more importantly, it was the man who had remade the galaxy, turning centuries of oppression into the foundation for something entirely new. In the end, they had all learned the most human truth of all. Never insult someone's dignity unless you're prepared to face the consequences of your actions. The galaxy would remember this day for generations to come, and most importantly, it would remember that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who keeps his calm composure while everything burns around him. The new order had begun and humanity stood ready to lead by example rather than force.